Welcome to week 2 of I Believe. We're studying what we believe as helpfully summarized in the creeds and confessions, these documents that have stood the test of time in the history of our church. And we're especially looking at the Heidelberg Catechism and using it as a tool that helps us understand the Bible better. So, as a way of introduction and review, that's what this is. This is a study of a catechism, which is a summary of Christian doctrine in Q&A format that is a tool that helps us understand the Bible. And now, before we get into the meat of today's teaching, I just want to talk a little bit about how you use this as a tool for Bible study. The first thing you should know is you can find the Heidelberg Catechism in print or digital edition. The print looks something like this, the old edition and the new edition, same thing. And no matter what edition you're using, you can find that the questions and answers are written here. And beneath those questions and answers is fine print. It's footnotes. And those footnotes are the scripture references from which these truths are being drawn. And so if you want to know why we believe a certain thing, look at the footnote and look up that scripture. These are the scriptures that will be helpful to meditate on, to think about, to pray about, and to memorize. Now, if you're using the digital edition, it's almost even easier. Let me show you how. I'm going to throw Google here on the screen. The way I find the digital edition of the Heidelberg Catechism is by typing CRCNA Heidelberg Catechism. And that takes us to the Christian Reformed Church's version here. It's a modern translation, very easily read. It's the one we've been using. And you can see here in the right-hand column, you can view it as a PDF. And so right here is exactly what we saw in the print edition. So you can print that out if you like. But even more useful here in the center column is the table of contents. Here's what we did last week. We talked about what it was, and then we looked at Q&A 1 and 2. There's Q&A 1. And notice underneath Q&A 1, here's all the scripture footnotes. So for instance, if you want to know why belong is such an important word and where that's found in the Bible, look at footnote 1. Click that text, and there you go. You were bought with a price. So I think it's really important to take the time to look up those footnotes and again to use those scriptures as the bulk of your study. Now, as further way of introduction, remember last week we said the theme of this catechism is found in question and answer 1, which is comfort, which we said is not just for the dark days, but it's strength for living. Comfort coming from the words con and fortis, which means with strength. And so the catechism is offering us strength for getting through life. And to enjoy this comfort, we have to know 3 things. Remember, question and answer 2. First, how great our sin and misery are. Second, how we're set free from them. And third, how we can thank God for such deliverance. Sin, salvation, service. That's the basic outline and structure of the catechism. So today we're going to dive into that first big section, sin, our misery, our guilt. And I want to begin just by thinking about this question. What is misery? Our lives are filled with misery, unfortunately. You don't have to do much more than turn on the evening news or scroll through your Facebook feed to see all that is wrong with life. One of the books I was reading in preparation for this lesson gave a lot of examples. A person stands on top of a water tower ready to jump to her death. A child sobs because students in her school have unmercifully been teasing her all day about the way she looks. A high schooler cuts her arms, desperately trying to feel anything. A college student starves herself to try to have control over one thing in her chaotic life. A lonesome businessman spends Christmas Eve alone. A mother sinks into depression as she struggles against her abusive husband. A tiny nation becomes a battleground for one war after another. These are just a few examples. I think you'll agree with me that the present day, and indeed all of human history, is full of examples of misery. World wars, brutal dictatorships, human rights violations, self-interested people taking advantage of each other and repressing the poor, abusive parents. It's just not the way it's supposed to be. We all have that intuitive sense that there's a lot wrong with the world and wrong with our lives, and if we're honest enough, wrong with us as well. That it's not the way it's supposed to be. We know misery and we want to get rid of it, but all of the things I've just mentioned are symptoms, right? And I want to get at today, what is at the root of all of those symptoms? Well, the German word for misery that was used here in the Heidelberg Catechism is an interesting word, and it actually means exile. So right away we get, just in the title of the section, we get an idea about what it is at its deepest level. Beyond the symptoms, what is misery? And it is exile. The history of the Bible, from beginning to end, is the story of humanity in exile. That we have been cast out of the garden. Adam and Eve, the first humans, made this choice to rebel against God, to say no to His law, to His way of doing things. And as such, they were banned from His presence and exiled from life with God. And so when we talk about misery in the next few minutes together, that's kind of the picture I want you to have in mind, and the tone that you should feel is homesickness. That all of the things wrong with life we experience because life is life in exile. So why study this first? I think it's really important for a very obvious and simple reason. If you don't correctly diagnose a problem, there's no way that you can prescribe the appropriate cure. So if you were to go to a doctor with a problem, step one is diagnosis. We don't just start throwing random medications and procedures at things, but we have to have the right diagnosis. And so the Catechism only spends 3 weeks, 3 out of 52, on misery. It's a brief section, but it is first, and that is because to understand our situation as human beings, to understand why God had to do what God did for us, to understand life, we have to understand the miserable condition that sin has put us in. So let's dive right in. Question and answer 3 is where this all begins. Look at this. How can you come to know your misery? I want us to just notice the thrust of this question. How can we come to know our misery? I think that's really, really interesting that the Catechism would say you have to be taught, you have to be told that you're miserable. That's kind of counterintuitive, right? Most of us would think, hey, I know when I'm miserable. I have the flu, I'm miserable. You know, I've broken my toe, I'm miserable. Something horrible has happened in my life, I feel miserable. And yet, the Catechism says we have to come to know our misery. And it's for this reason, I think. There's a couple ways you can use the word miserable. You see them on the screen here. There's feeling miserable, which we've been talking about, but there's also performing miserably. And so sometimes we as human beings just don't perform well. We perform miserably. On the tennis courts, sometimes I perform miserably. On graded tests, sometimes we perform miserably. We get D's or C minuses. Now the interesting thing is, sometimes feeling miserable and performing miserably line up. So I didn't perform well on the tennis court, and I performed miserably, and now I feel miserable. But sometimes they don't. So sometimes someone could get a miserable grade on a test and not care. So they performed miserably, but they don't feel miserable. Well, I want to submit to you that when the Catechism uses the word miserable, it's really focusing more on the objective status of humanity, that we have performed miserably with regard to following God's ways, God's laws. And that has thrust us into our current situation of all the things we've talked about, all the symptoms we've talked about that are miserable, but it all originates with our original sin, this failing, this miserable performance with regard to the law of God. So again, the Heidelberg Catechism, question and answer 3, how do you come to know your misery? The law of God tells me. So notice that this section is thrusting us right away into considering the law of God. So where do we find that in the Bible? If you look at the footnotes, Romans 3:20 is mentioned, where Paul says, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by works of the law. Rather, through the law, We become conscious of our sin. We come to know our sin through the law. And again, Paul says in Romans chapter 7, I would not have known what sin was had it not been for the law. For I would not have known what coveting really was if the law had said, you shall not covet. And so in this section, we're using the law to what? To see God's will and to see how we fall short. Theologians call this using the law as a mirror. You know, sometimes you're not aware of what you look like until you look in the mirror or until someone's charitable enough to say, hey, you got something on your face. But you could go out into the world thinking you look great, thinking your hair is in place, until you see a mirror. And that mirror, that perfect mirror, is going to show you that your appearance, there's something wrong with it. And it's the same with the law. What Paul has said here in Romans chapter 3 and chapter 7 is, when we look into the law, it's like looking into a mirror, and it teaches us. It helps us know that we're falling short. It helps us know we're sinful. It helps us know we've performed miserably, which leads right into question and answer 4. So what is the law? Well, that's a great follow-up question, and I think that's why they put it next, Q&A 4. What does God's law require of us? And I just love that the answer is Jesus' own summary of the law. We get right to the heart of the matter. And Jesus summarized the law this way. Matthew 22, 37 through 40. You shall love, notice that word love, the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This total love and devotion for God. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love, there's that word again, your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commands hang all the law and the prophets. And so Jesus, when asked, what's the most important law, he boiled it all down to, he summarized it in this way, love God and love people. And that was no new information. That actually comes from the Old Testament. From Deuteronomy chapter 6, which says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. So love God. And Leviticus chapter 19, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus was saying, hey, this is nothing new, but behind all of the commandments, behind the 10 commandments, behind the hundreds and hundreds of rules that we have in the Old Testament, behind all of that is this simple principle, this concept of love, of putting God first, of putting other people first. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Remember all of those things we talked about before. Remember all of the symptoms of misery in our world. Would they exist if we really loved God and loved other people? Would people be cutting themselves? Would people be considering suicide? Would people be lonely? Would people be bullied? Would people be oppressed and repressed? No. So love is a great summary of what we're called to do. And it's even in the epistles. Paul says to the Galatians, carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. Carry each other's burdens, care for each other, support each other, love each other. And if you'll just do that, you'll fulfill God's will for you. And so the Heidelberg Catechism says simply that. What's the law? It's this: love God and love other people. It sounds simple, but can you do this? Look into your own life. As I look into my own life, it sounds simple to love other people. And yet, if we're honest with ourselves, if I'm honest with myself, I don't do it well. I don't do it perfectly. And that's the exact next question here. Question and answer 5. Can you live up to all of this perfectly? Because that's God's standard. And the answer, no. I have a natural tendency to hate God and my neighbor. That's a strong word right there, to hate God. Not only that we don't love him well enough, or our neighbor well enough, but it's saying we have this natural tendency out of the womb to hate God, to despise him, to run away from him, to not follow his rules for our lives, and to not care about the people he's created. Now, if you're brave enough to admit that truth, you're not alone. The writers of Scripture would agree they also don't live up to this high calling perfectly. Look at 1 John. He says, if we claim to be without sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. If we claim we have not sinned, we make him out to be a liar, and his word is not in us. Paul says it like this, Romans 3, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Genesis 6, the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on earth, that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Jeremiah 17, the heart is deceitful among all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? Ephesians 2:1, as for you, you were dead in transgressions and sins. Titus 3:3, at one time we too were foolish, disobedient, deceived, enslaved by all kinds of passions and pleasures. We lived in malice and envy, being hated and hating one another. And finally, Romans 3:9-18, a beautiful statement of the theology of sin, the doctrine of sin, and how it affects us at our core. Paul says, Jews and Gentiles alike are all under the power of sin. As it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands. There's no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They have together become worthless, and there is no one who does good, not even one. Their throats are open graves, their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery mark their ways, and the way of peace they do not know. There is no fear of God before their eyes. And as Paul writes this to the Roman church, again, he's not writing anything new. All you see on the screen is from the Old Testament that he's quoting. He's quoting Psalms 14, 53, 5, 140, 10, and 36, as well as Ecclesiastes 7 and Isaiah 59. This is the truth of our situation. And I think it's really helpful as we look back on what we've just learned, to reread, to meditate on, to ponder, to pray about, to memorize those verses. And hopefully they resonate with you that we do have a problem as the human race. And the problem is we are born with a natural tendency not to love, but to hate God and to hate one another. And we're going to hop on to the question that naturally arises from that next week. That question being, where did this come from? How did this happen? This doesn't seem fair. Is God asking me to do things that I just can't do? And those are great questions to ask. I hope that as we study this, you begin to naturally ask those kind of questions. And we're going to pick up there next week as we study week 3 of the Heidelberg Catechism. We'll see you then.